Hello learners, welcome to this session on Methodological Framework of Development Communication Part 2. We have discussed about communication-based assessment in Methodological Framework of Development Communication Part 1 session. We had discussed about the principles of development communication and also the communication-based assessment part in the methodological framework. There we had focused on the aspect of dialoguing as an important tool of development communication, and also on how that brings about a change in the way interventions take place. So we need to understand here that behavior change communication does not happen in a very short period of time. We need to understand that the Indian communities are deeply rooted in culture and the way their social interactions take place. So keeping this in mind, we cannot be imposing change on them, but rather engage with people in dialogues and also try to make them understand and reflect upon their own issues so that they can act upon their own critical issues, which is the basic essence of development communication. And this can only happen through participation, which we learned in the previous session. Now, in this session, we will be moving on to understanding developing communication strategy design in the light of development communication methodological framework. We shall be able to discuss the communication roadmap leading to change, describe the communication toolbox for implementation, and understand the importance of communication for monitoring and evaluation in this development communication methodological framework. And I'm sure you will be able to gain all this after listening to this session. Now, what is communication strategy design? A communication strategy can be defined as a well-planned series of actions aimed at achieving specific objectives through the use of communication methods, techniques, and approaches. The definitions for strategy and communication strategy highlight that the starting point should lie in the objectives. So for any strategy, need not be just communication strategy. We all know that we have to lay down the objectives and state them very clearly. So to be effective, strategy should be based on sound research data, and in the new communication paradigm, which is based on participation, research is not simply an extractive tool. That is, researchers extracting information to be elaborated on and used by outside experts does not work. But research is a part of a heuristic process engaging stakeholders in the investigative process. So heuristic here is more about researching, investigating, exploring, and trying to find out the needs of the communities, the problems of the communities. So communication managers should rely on specialists with the proper skills for design of communication operational strategies. So managers should rely on specialists with the proper skills for design of communication operational strategies. Now, the communication specialist, which could be you, should first look at the broader picture and decide which type of communication mix is needed. For example, a communication strategy on the support of a decentralization program might require strengthening the internal communication of key institutions, improving the image of the project or institution, and lastly, engaging stakeholders in order to support change. So this is at the institutional level. In this case, the communication strategy will be multi-pronged, as it will have internal, corporate, and development communication strategic lines of intervention. So this will happen in a multi-pronged manner, means it will happen at different levels and at different stages. In some cases, advocacy may also be required. Quite frequently, the communication strategy is based on a single type of communication. Defining objectives prima facie is the key step. Most of the success of a communication strategy depends on the way the objectives are identified and formulated. We try to advocate and encourage objectives which are designed on the SMART principles, which are objectives which are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Now, the development communication specialist has to understand from the situation analysis, which we discussed in the previous session, in the part 1 session also, what type of communication approaches, media, or messages would be most effective, most suitable to achieve the intended change. For example, mass distribution of brochures and other literature on how to prevent the spread of a disease is of little use in areas with high illiteracy rates. Why? Because they will not be able to read literature which is given in brochure or in newspapers or in handouts. Such factors need to be considered and effectively included in the strategy mix, which combines professional knowledge with creative skills, making the design of a strategy an exercise in the art and science of communication. Every design of a communication strategy is very unique in content, methods, and media. If you look ahead and look back at what happened earlier, the communication strategy which you would have adapted earlier, you'll see that that is different from what you're doing now. So every communication strategy is very contextual, like I already discussed in the previous session, and it is unique in content, methods, and media. And without precise information and accurate information, it is impossible to know which approach to apply. For example, social marketing, community mobilization, training, and education are some approaches, and which level to address. That is, whether you have to address their awareness level or knowledge level, or you want to address their attitude, or you want to bring out a change in their behavior. Now, in order to identify and properly position the starting point for the communication intervention, it is vital to know the perceptions and positions of the community people. For example, a baseline study conducted to define and quantify women's awareness, knowledge, attitudes, and practices indicated that women did not have any specific interest in going to a health facility to find out about why they experienced weakness in pregnancy. Now, this is a very, very critical aspect in India, where we see that maternal deaths, maternal mortality is largely because of anemia, malnutrition, and other associated illnesses. So, but many women across the country, particularly in rural and tribal areas, do not go to any health facility which is available to them nearby, particularly to any public health facility. So we understand that this could be attributed to a combination of two factors. That is, their limited knowledge about health issues related to anemia and malnutrition, and their lack of understanding of any dangerous implications on the fetus in the womb due to anemia and malnutrition. So, on the basis of these findings, you can design the communication strategy around two issues, that is, a capacity building program, equipping them with all the knowledge and skills, on how to combat anemia, and an awareness raising campaign, of course. Now, some most common communication approaches which could be used in communication strategy design are social marketing, advocacy, information dissemination and campaigns, information education and communication, popularly known as IEC, education and training, institutional strengthening, community mobilization, non-directive participatory communication, socio-cultural sensitivity, keeping language appropriateness based upon local needs, political compatibility. The way you communicate with the people over there should be compatible with the political dynamics of that community. The psychological appropriateness of the beneficiaries, the community people whom you're addressing, and expected achievements from them, the expected changes in them. Now, communication channels and media could be ranging from electronic media such as video, radio, and the internet to traditional channels such as popular theatre, folklore, folk music, dance, drama, theatre, drums, and storytelling, and pass through the whole range of printed products such as newspaper, leaflets, brochures, posters, and flip charts. Like I had already mentioned earlier, this would again be location specific, and it has to be contextualized based upon the existing background of the community people, their literacy levels, their understanding levels, their level of awareness, and their level of existing knowledge. Sometimes opinion leaders in the village or in the urban setting, wherever you're conducting the communication process, or individuals having a significant influence or credibility in the community can become effective channels in a communication program. Now, which specific channel or media mix to be used depends on a number of factors. Often we are asked this question, we ask these questions to ourselves too. The objectives of the communication intervention, for example, awareness, raising advocacy, mobilization. What is the objective of your communication intervention? It could be these. Then it could be characteristics of the audiences such as literacy rates, which we just spoke of, the preferred information sources which they like could be one of the factors. Then the social environment, which is available media, cultural context, whatever is existing, whatever the cultural practices are there. In many areas, there are varied practices of breastfeeding also. So all these have to be looked into when you look at a particular communication intervention. And of course, lastly, the available resources. So these could be human as well as natural resources. The communication specialist, which is you, could always be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of each channel. While television is known for its high appeal for entertainment and awareness raising on specific issues, it is not equally effective in changing audience attitudes and behaviors. Often we see that radio is the preferred medium in rural settings, but except in the case of the many community radios which we see across in our country that use it in a more participatory way for development oriented purposes, it has similar limitations to television. I'm sure you must have seen other videos in this course which are related to community radio, participatory filmmaking and all. So you need to choose the specific channel or media mix very carefully when it comes to communication intervention in a particular area. So printed materials can be of value when most of the population can read and write, which is not always the case in project settings. Traditional forms of communication such as storytelling or popular theatre, even if reaching more limited number of individuals, can be rather effective in discussing sensitive issues and gradually inducing change in the attitudes and behaviors of the audience. For example, we can think of adolescent reproductive and sexual health here. So when we use traditional forms of communication such as storytelling or puppet or any other form of folklore or theatre, the audience understanding in a better manner and bring about a better gradual change in the attitudes and behavior of the audience. So whatever channel is selected, it is important to have a sound rationale or a sound meaning or purpose for the selection of that channel. Using a communication mix is also very crucial at times. In many instances, multimedia campaigns have been demonstrated to be more effective than one medium campaigns in achieving intended results. New information technologies such as the internet provide a wide range of options whose potential is yet to be fully explored and taken into account. We are seeing that this era of internet is gradually emerging, and as India is bracing to meet the constraints of Digital India campaign, we are seeing that the internet penetration is really reaching out to communities at a pace. Once all the elements of the strategy have been discussed, assessed and defined, the path is clear for implementation of the message design activities. Now, some tools on communication strategy design. A very popular tool called the 5 management decisions template. It is also called 5 communication management decisions. Helps to define and monitor a communication strategy by asking the following questions. Number one, which audiences need to be reached? Second, what behavior changes are required or need to be avoided? Third, which messages will induce the desired behavior? Fourth, which among the available channels are most effective for the audience of interest? And lastly, how will the communication process be monitored and evaluated? These five questions are instrumental in ensuring that communication activities are relevant and supportive of the project objectives. Some of the other communication strategy design tools are the logical framework analysis or log frame, objective oriented project planning, and the situation analysis framework. I'd like to emphasize and elaborate more on the situation analysis framework here. It is also known as SAF and is another method used effectively to enhance project design through participatory communication strategies, especially in rural development projects. It provides useful guidelines on how to develop and organize a participatory research-based communication strategy, and it can be used effectively for complex and multi-level communication interventions. Now, let us discuss the communication roadmap leading to change. So far, we've been discussing about communication-based, the strategy, communication strategy design. Now, let us also see how all these lead to change. What is the roadmap? The communication objectives, which are preferably to be based on the SMART principle, which we discussed earlier, are most important for the strategy when drafting the action plan. The action plan should state clearly who is responsible for each activity and what is the expected outcome once the activities are implemented. Before the implementation of the planned activities can begin, there are usually preparatory actions to be carried out. These can be divided broadly into two types. Number one, production of materials, and number two, training of relevant personnel. So without the two, both of them are not mutually exclusive, but they are dependent on each other. According to the needs identified in the research, that is the situation analysis, and defined in the strategy, it might be necessary to produce posters, brochures, radio programs, and other kind of audio visuals. Pre-testing of communication materials should be conducted with pilot groups and representatives of the intended population where you want to conduct the communication intervention. Now, there are certain steps which we could chart in the communication roadmap leading to change. Based on what we have discussed so far in session 1 and session 2, we can now chart the communication roadmap. The starting point is always about getting acquainted with the situation. Step 1 requires reviewing available documentation and conducting interviews. Step 2 is where the genuine field research, that is situation analysis for need assessment, begins by engaging stakeholders in order to build trust and mutual understanding. In step 3, communication is used to uncover risks and opportunities while probing stakeholders' knowledge and perceptions about the main problem or problems. In step 4, a communication specialist is expected to identify the main causes of the problems that need to be solved. Looking at the causes is often more important than accurately defining the main problem. Sometimes we try to overlook the causes or we just breeze through the causes, but it is always important to look at the causes with a lot of energy and time. Because to be successful, the solutions devised need to address the root causes of a problem rather than the problem itself. Moving on to step 5 is where viable options and solutions are identified. These are then ranked in terms of best choices. What could be the options and what could be the solutions? Step 6 is critical because based on all relevant data from the previous steps, it aims to transform the top solutions identified into SMART objectives, that is, objectives that are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. This step marks the end of the research phase or the communication-based assessment and the beginning of the strategy, which is the design phase, which we discussed in this session today. Step 7 requires the definition of primary and secondary audiences of the communication strategy, such as their background, knowledge, opinions, and ways of life, and other relevant information collected in the communication based assessment. In step 8, it is very important to make absolutely clear the type of change that communication is expected to achieve. It can be knowledge, behavior, or empowerment as changes, amongst others. Each type of change, whether it is knowledge, behavioral, or empowerment change amongst people, requires different communication approaches. Now, step 9 is concerned with the selection of the communication approaches which are naturally linked with the type of change defined in the previous step. Social marketing, information dissemination, and community mobilization are some of the most frequent approaches. Once the approaches have been defined in step 10, the communication specialist can proceed to select the right media and channels for the intended objectives. Once again, this decision is taken reviewing all the information collected during the research phase. So this was just discussed before we discussed all the steps. A similar approach is required for step 11 about message design. To be effective, messages must be developed having in mind the audience's needs and ways of thinking. In other words, the design of the message should be derived from local stakeholders' worldview. Finally, step 12 indicates the end of the journey. We have come to the end of our intervention program. While each step can be different according to the situation and the objective of the initiative, the overall process remains the same most of the time. The main tip to remember is to make sure to analyze the issues properly and not to assume that the best technical solution guarantees the highest rate of success. Quite often, sustainable change is about social ownership and local knowledge. Now, communication toolbox for implementation is essential for our knowledge, because with information and recommendations from the development process, the managers can work directly with the various specialists such as radio and video producers, training specialists, and graphic designers. Development communication staff consult with many of these specialists in the research and design phases of process. The tools used in this phase relate mostly to the specific media selected, for example, print, radio, video, and on the training needed to carry out the successful implementation on the activities. So, considering the wide range of applications in the production of communication materials and media and the vast amount of publications available on this subject, a reader can easily access any of those publications dealing with any of the different media of interest, such as radio, video, print, or the web. We come to the monitoring and evaluation part in the methodological framework of development communication. So, after implementation, we need to also look into the monitoring and evaluation indicators, because often we tend to overlook this aspect in any development communication intervention. According to the World Bank and DFID, following are the reasons for evaluating the impact of communication: assessing the role of a particular project or process in contributing to a development project or social change, gaining advocacy with decision makers, refining and fine-tuning the process of implementation, learning from past mistakes, what has worked and what has not worked, ensuring a positive process for the community and the stakeholders, ensuring good management and accountability to donors and decision makers, making continued funding possible, improved research and evaluation methods and approaches. So, these are some of the very deep rooted reasons for evaluating the impact of your communication intervention. This makes us more and more informed, and we can easily correct the mistakes which happened in the past in order to make our communication intervention more effective and successful. The last phase in the methodological framework of development communication is monitoring and evaluation. And even though in order to assess the impact of an initiative, evaluation is carried out at the end of an initiative, it is necessary that relevant indicators and related measurements be defined and carried out also at the beginning of the intervention. It is very, very necessary that we, identify those indicators and carry out small periodic assessments while the intervention starts and during the intervention phase. We always end up doing evaluation towards the end of the communication intervention, because we feel that we can assess the impact of any initiative only towards the end. But think of this: once we start assessing periodically, small phases of assessment happen in the beginning itself and during the time of intervention, how effective and how impactful our intervention would be. And also, measuring the difference between the starting and the ending points is often the only way to measure the impact of communication. Evaluation methods are usually divided into qualitative and quantitative categories. We all know about this. These could be interviews, surveys, and baseline studies. It is essential to think about monitoring and evaluation indicators from day one. Now, this brings us to the end of the methodological framework of development communication. So, like what I said, traditional communication for behavioral change approach will not work because of the strong cultural system prevailing in India. So, which is why we try to understand the methodological framework of development communication using different tools and strategies for communication interventions for development. We have now come to the end of this session, in which I will be uh, suggesting you to conduct an activity. Uh, you need to refer to the following book and do a detailed study of the methodological framework of development communication, which we understood in two sessions, part 1 and part 2, and refer to the book by Paolo Mefalopoulos, um, who has written this book for the World Bank, which is Development Communication Sourcebook, Broadening the Boundaries of Communication. And it is also available on the website for you all to read and refer to. I thank all the partners who are engaged with us in this course and contributed to this course. Thank you for your patient listening.